Hello everyone. So it's my absolute pleasure to be chairing this session, the people session of the conference. I think people is a thread running through all the talks, and we've heard so many times already the mention of the importance of communities, considering people in whatever you're doing. We've got a great lineup of speakers. First up, it's my pleasure to introduce Genovesi from ISPRA and chair of the IUCN's Invasive Species Specialist Group. Piero.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, and very nice to see so many friends here. Really fantastic conference, so thank you, Tony, and all the organizers, and so interesting to see the conference in Europe after the first two we organized in New Zealand, where eradication is a kind of a religion, so I think it's important to see that we keep, also in Europe, we keep the level that New Zealand raised. So we'll talk of many different things, not only people, not only the social aspects, and probably some of the elements have been already said in other presentations, but I think that it's important in this occasion to try to sum up a little bit the concepts that we've been working with over the years. So forgive me if I will be repeating some of the elements, data, and also showing some of the slides you have already seen. But let me start from slides that I have parasitized from RSPB, because I think it's important to remind why we work on this issue and why we are in Scotland. It's not only for the South Georgia project that is an incredible success. For us, for Europeans, Scotland is also very important because it hosts many threatened birds. And as you all know, the work on invasive species often started from bird specialists, because that's where invasive species are more harmful. And the work done in Scotland has been essential for protecting some of our European birds in particular. This is a recent paper. If you look at which are the priority islands for doing eradications in the UK, of course, they are all up here because of most of them, because Scotland has plenty of islands and also plenty of birds. So I think it's important to start from the fact that we work on this issue because this is a real problem for biodiversity. And there are an increasing number of papers and studies confirming this evidence. So this is a paper that has been mentioned in a couple of presentations. One element that I want to stress is that this paper has put together information on threatened species and invasive species, and we are learning a lot from cross-referencing information from different sources. What we can see from this very recent data is that if we look at extinct species and the causes of extinction, for some groups, not only birds, but of course herbs and even plants, invasive species are a major problem. So we know that this is a huge problem for biodiversity, for one of the causes of biodiversity loss at the global scale. And that's why we have been over the years asking to, calling the global community to be more active on this threat. And of course, also these numbers have been mentioned. Islands are particularly vulnerable. So islands host a lot of biodiversity, and on islands invasive species are particularly harmful. So I think this is the core element that bridges all the people that have come up to here and all the communities in the world that have started working on this threat some decades ago. As you can see from the graph, of course, it depends on the regions of the world. There are some regions that are particularly vulnerable to invasive species, but in general, whenever you go to islands, this is a key problem. However, it was said yesterday, and I think it's an important message, we have to explain to the world and to our decision makers that this is not only an environmental problem. This is the assessment that has been pivotal for convincing the European Parliament to adopt a legislation on invasive species. I have my friend Paul Walton here. We work in many people at the European level to convince European decision makers to work on invasive species. You know, Europe is quite reluctant to work on this problem compared to other regions of the world. But after many years of discussion and assessments and studies, they were convinced that this was necessary. But the main argument was that this was a problem to our economy and to our health. So summing up the two elements, the problem for biodiversity and the problem for economy and for health, what comes out in Europe, and it's probably the same everywhere, is that the same species causing environmental harms are also impacting our life, our economy, our health. So the message that the Parliament took is that in this case, protecting biodiversity, investing money in protecting biodiversity, help us safeguard our livelihood, and it's a convenient investment. And actually, all the assessments we did are very cautious, so we didn't want to sell something. We wanted to show real evidences, so we've been very cautious in how we handle the data to show that it was a good idea to work on this issue. And actually, in a moment in which the European Parliament had the mandate to only adopt legislations on the development and employment and the financial crisis, they adopted with a large majority the legislation on invasive species because they thought it was also helping the economic development of our region. Of course, I said we know more also because we have now more information that we can interlink on threatened species and invasive species. We know that there are some regions of the world that are particularly vulnerable, and we know where the priority areas of work are. Sometimes we don't give priority to the priority areas and to the priority species. It depends on the local perception, on the local priorities in terms of decision makers. But I think at least we are feeding decision making with information that can guide action if decision makers, as in this case from the UK perspective, have the passion to listen to what we say. And this is what is particularly alarming. So we have compiled many information from all over the world on invasive species and on introduced species. And we put together data from the GWAII database, from IUCN databases, from all sources. And the information that have been published early this year showed that the number of invasive species is growing in all regions of the world and in all taxonomic groups. So we are still in a phase where we don't see a saturation effect. Numbers are still growing. We see some elements that seem to show a slowing down or some increase for the species that are introduced more often intentionally. And this is the cumulative number of introduced species. If you look at the first record, so an indication of how numbers are growing, the speed of growth of this problem, if we, even on islands, we still see an increase. So we still see new species arriving in all islands of the world, or in many islands of the world, and again in many taxonomic groups. Perhaps in mammals it's not like that, and in fish it seems that we have a slowing down in this increased rate. But this is another message that has been particularly important. It is very urgent to do something because the situation is still growing at a dramatic pace. And then we come, this is probably, this will win the prize for the most seen map, on the one on top right. But I think it is worth repeating also to acknowledge the work done by Island Conservation and by many others. I don't know if you all know that the work for compiling the database on eradication started at the previous conference in Auckland. So we discussed with Island Conservation if it was a good idea to establish and maintain a database, and definitely it has been an excellent idea because we published so many papers led by Island Conservation that have had a huge mediatic impact. So they've been reported in many, many media around the world, the conservation silver bullet, so the benefits of eradications globally. So we have shown that the work that you all are doing is very important and is bringing to concrete, very, very significant benefits for the global biodiversity. We know that things are improving. I don't need to repeat what you have heard today, the presentation by Greg Howell this morning showing how eradications are improving, are managing to treat larger islands and more complex systems around the world. And I think it's also important that we tell stories. So we have single species recoveries. Yesterday, the fantastic presentation we saw in South Georgia. We need to tell stories because people understand more easily stories than graphs. And I think this is one very famous story, the storm petrel in New Zealand. They thought it was extinct, but after the eradication of rats and cats, it showed up again. This is the rarest snake in the world that has increased by 20-fold on 4 islands after an eradication. And there are so many examples, and many others have been and will be discussed here in the next few days. From all over the world. So I think combining data with stories is very important. Then we are in a phase where we have many innovative tools. Some of these are more mediatic than real. Some are more are particularly promising. So let's see what happens with the struggle with the tree brown snake in Guam. The robot to control lionfish has attracted a lot of attention by the global media, and the Magna Carpa boat is also particularly appealing for media. But today we heard another promising element that is more likely to change the scenery, and is the gene drive. So Carl Campbell and several colleagues have worked at exploring the possibilities for this new tool. I'm not a genetician, so you know more than me about it. I just understood that this is a tool that can very rapidly spread into a population some tool that we decide is important to bring into the population. Of course, those of you who were at the discussion on the gene tools today know that there are many concerns, but it's also a potentially very powerful tool. So we are at the edge of something new, possibly, that could change our work on invasive species. Even if there are concerns, let's talk of malaria. So how can we say stop working on this issue when this potentially could help us removing malaria from regions where it causes over 1 million deaths annually. So malaria is killing more people than we do in our wars and in our attacks and in everything. And of course, there is also an economic cost. So there is a strong pressure for developing this technique. And the technique can, of course, be applied also to invasive species. I was in the Hawaii in September for the World Conservation Congress. In Hawaii, the avian malaria brought by mosquitoes have decimated, have caused the extinction of 50% of the birds, and this dramatic loss is continuing. So there is a very strong call from those communities who say we need immediately something to protect our birds. And of course, there are other areas where this can be an important tool. They are exploring the possibility to remove the toxicity of the cane toad in Australia. It could be used to control or even eradicate the European carp again from rivers of Australia. So, and we're very close to field testing. So potentially we are in an area where our work could have a huge progress in a short term. But we are talking on communities, so we need to take into account both the call for more action, but also the concerns of the local communities of the world on what we are doing. Even for plant lovers, there are concerns on the eradications, and there are oppositions to the work we do in many regions of the world. Of course, some Italians have been struggling with the opposition of people more than probably anywhere else in the world. As you may know, I was even found guilty of poaching because I was controlling gray squirrels some 20 years ago. So Italy is an area where this is particularly a problem. And now, luckily, I gave the front work to Valentina that is here. There is a poster on the work we do on gray squirrels in central Italy. The opposition to the work we do is the only population of gray squirrels in all central Italy. So this is the possible start of an invasion that could affect the entire peninsula. But even there, local people don't want us to enter in their gardens to remove gray squirrels. And we have to work every day convincing them, door to door, sending letters, using techniques like sterilization of animals where possible to try to convince them. So it has come out in many occasions yesterday and today, local communities, the social aspect, the social parameters, the human dimensions are crucial in some areas of the world especially. And the access to private land, in fact, is a problem in many regions. This is a paper, a study that has not yet been published. I saw it last year in South Africa, where they are trying to eradicate the cultural toad that is threatening the endemic leopard toad in the Cape Town region. But the main constraint to the eradication is that the owners in the area, that are very rich people, don't grant access for removing these toads. And without access in all the areas, this eradication will not be feasible. So this is a problem in many areas of the world. And we know of the many legal problems. We heard something about Italy, but it's the same in Portugal. We heard about Argentina earlier today. So legal problems linked to the limited perception of this problem are common in many areas where there are many people. More than, of course, the science of eradication started in places like this one, and this is the level of traffic of vessels, and then we work here, and this is a normal island in the Mediterranean, so there are some differences in the places and the human context. So we don't work, this is not South Georgia, it's warmer. But it also has some challenges, so not the storms, but others. And of course, this is a key problem. We discussed that. It's not only a problem, it's also an opportunity, but we need to work more with people than we do with the biological aspects. Why I put the risk of reinvasion here? Because, of course, I don't know, those of you who have heard the presentation by Dario earlier today on rodent eradications in Italy. This is one story, but in this case, it's not a reinvasion because it re-arrived. Somebody brought back rats after an eradication. They even brought some rabbits together with the rats, just because there were tensions between some people and the owners of the island. So in the human environment, things like this one can happen, and we have to take into account this problem and these new challenges. How can we do that? Of course, it's possible. I mean, we know that we can incorporate risk of reinvasions or the risk of conflicts. James Russell mentioned the conflict curve in his talk on New Zealand. We can incorporate that when we prioritize work, and we can incorporate that when we estimate the costs of projects that are going to be more costly in areas where we have this kind of problems, also because eradications are probably not going to last forever. So biosecurity is not only a full solution. You also need to consider the risk that a species may always reappear in an area that you have treated. However, we have also fantastic examples of successes. This is a story that I think you all know. Again, it's quite incredible, because the ruddy duck is a beautiful bird that is causing problems in Spain, but it needs to be controlled in the UK. So it's even more difficult to convince people that love birds that these beautiful birds need to be shot for something they don't do here. But nevertheless, even in this case, despite the increase in the population over the years, when the UK started working on the eradication, the results have been impressive. All over the country, my colleagues in DEFRA managed to remove all the single nucleuses of these birds, and in fact, we see the positive outcome of this work because the population in Spain has a very, very low number of hybrids, and we haven't had hybridization in the last few years. I hope Ian Henderson won't correct my data that are based on a recent report by him. There are now left around 20 individuals, perhaps 19 today if one has been shot. No confirmed breeding in 2016. So it's really something that is going to happen. And what is interesting is that the UK, after Scotland, has adopted an order that now permits, theoretically, it hasn't been applied yet, but it could permit to have access to private land even if owners don't want you in to shoot the birds. So, and this is, I think it's important that we go also for legal solutions, but to have legal solutions, we need to have support from the entire society, from our decision makers. And this is another famous example that I have used in previous presentations, but I think it's important to remind. There is one small, not that small, region of the world that is rat-free, and actually at a very limited cost. So Alberta in Canada manages to keep the country rat-free because all the community works together since the 50s to keep rats out of their country. And it costs something like $400,000 a year, nothing compared to what we spend in permanent control in our countries, just because everybody helps achieving this element that requires permanent control at the border of the country. So we are not talking anymore of eradication on islands, but we have heard stories about similar projects, and we heard, for example, that in New Zealand there was a very nice map yesterday showing how diffuse is becoming the use of fences. This is actually Hawaii, to keep areas where local communities can remove pests to protect their birds, especially kiwis. In New Zealand, there is such a pride of the communities in working together for protecting their biodiversity. This is a totally different approach, but somehow this is an approach that shows that we can think in some areas of a phased approach to eradication. Somehow what South Georgia permitted to do, working area by area, that can in some case be much more convenient, even economically. It can help us addressing invasions at a much larger scale than we have done so far. We heard yesterday about the virtual barriers of intense trapping, and similar to what has been done in native island again in New Zealand for reducing the reinvasion of pests. And New Zealand, we heard over in these days about the new, incredibly ambitious vision of the predator-free New Zealand. So I won't go into detail. You heard many times about this new vision of the country. Is it too ambitious? This is difficult to say at this stage. I think it should be a call for us to be more ambitious in general. It is definitely based on a huge support by the local communities there, but also on the level of science that has shown that much more ambitious results can be achieved if we work with the communities. And I think we mentioned in these days is not only that eradications have not been done only for environmental purposes. We managed to remove rinderpest virus from the earth, and it didn't cost nobody knows the cost because nobody calculates the cost. Every country does its bit in terms of vaccination of livestock, but the rinderpest virus has been totally removed from earth. It took a few decades. And it was the control has involved all countries of the world. Actually started in 1700, the development of measures that have remained partly the same over the centuries. In 2001, last reported outbreak of a rinderpest in a buffalo in Kenya, and in 2011, the FAO and the OIE announced the completion of this eradication. We have removed also the smallpox, and other 2 diseases are close to be eradicated from earth. Just to say that working with the communities and working with giving responsibility to the different countries can really permit us to achieve objectives that could seem unrealistic. Okay, going down in the ambitious, we are in Europe. We have adopted the regulation that I told you, but we will see in the next years how these obligations, because for the first time ever in Europe, we have obligations to do eradications, and we have obligations to do control of key invasive species. The legislation is based on a list of invasive species of union concern. When one of the species arrives, we are obliged to do something. And if you don't do something in the European system, you pay huge fines. So we are somehow forced to do something, even if we don't like it. So opportunities for scaling up the work on invasive species. Just my very rough summary of the different elements we've been discussing in these days. We started from, these remote islands, and we always said all individuals need to be targeted, and the risk of reinvasion needs to be 0. Then we are working now in areas where this is not really the case. We need to incorporate risk of reinvasions, the cost, the social parameters into the system, and especially we need to focus more on the biosecurity after the eradication has been completed. We are now in the ground of these more flexible approaches, managing invasive species to 0 density in large ecosystems, also using fences or other form of virtual barriers. And we also heard yesterday the presentation of gray squirrel and red squirrels, showing that a permanent control in some cases can help us achieving one conservation aim, in this case keeping the red squirrel population alive in our territory. So even permanent control should enter in our portfolio of management measures if well planned. And then there is the final option that I'm a bureaucrat, I work in the government. This is the more likely option for many cases, and is doing something to show that you're working on a problem without solving it. And permanent control, I think, is very much at risk of going in that area that is obviously the least preferred option for us all. If we only could manage to use the control effort that we enforce now in the right way, we could already achieve much more ambitious results that we get at the moment. So we need to be, especially in Europe, far from the risk of just doing something to respond to legislation. How to convince people to do more? I was really impressed when I was in the Hawaii by the huge call by many local communities to do more on invasive species, and that's why in that occasion we launched in a totally unplanned way the Honolulu Challenge. So many communities, especially because we were in the Hawaii, so there were many people from the Pacific saying we need to do more. So even if it was not in the official program, we agreed that we needed to come out from that meeting with something strong on invasive species. In my experience in this political meeting, it was the first time that happened, that something started without any preparation at the Congress. Usually you prepare everything in advance. But this started there, and we had a lot of interest by decision makers and also by many government organizations and NGOs from around the world. Some of them are in this room. New Zealand, Australia, BirdLife, Conservación de las Islas in Mexico. So they immediately say, yes, let's try to work together at scaling the work on invasive species. And we presented the same initiative at the Conference of the Parties of the CBD, where it was very warmly received. And the New Zealand government and the UK government made it explicit in the plenaries where the ministers were present, and this is important. It's an important issue. So from my experience, I see that there is a little bit more attention than ever before by decision makers, and the pest-free campaign is one of the many examples. What does it mean? It means that we have an opportunity that I think we should use to try to raise the profile of the work we all do. This initiative is meant for helping you all to raise more easily funds, to convince more easily your decision makers that something can be done. Let's see what happens. We saw the commitments of New Zealand and also of UK that committed to put money, real money, in developing biosecurity measures for their overseas territories. And there are many commitments by other organizations to do concrete work on invasive species. On Thursday, late afternoon, we are going to discuss more what the Honolulu Challenge can become. But this is something that is a tool for you. It's not a new initiative that is going to drain resources. The idea is to use it to help the work that our community is doing and that countries around the world are doing. So I really hope that working together we can make it a useful tool for us and for the world. And many organizations joined this initiative, so it's not an IUCN initiative, it's a joint initiative. IUCN is committing to help. And we are committing to help for what we do probably better, that is organizing information, bridging the gap between science and decision making. Again, I stress the importance of concrete action, but don't forget the importance of compiling data. There is this crazy guy over here that I know is pushing us all. I'm late with the manuscript. But I think that the work done in New Zealand to compile information from many projects that usually go unreported, it happens. Putting those information in databases, sorry, oh gosh, where did they? Oh, go. Putting this information in databases, that is boring, I know it's boring, but has managed to, oh gosh, that's my fault, has permitted to prepare the studies that have convinced or helped convince the community that it was important to work on this threat. So even this boring part of the work, the boring work of Dick, I think is very important, because out of the, I know you're fun in pushing people, but I mean, compiling all the manuscripts must be a nightmare. This is really important, and you know, linking what we've done in these years has been working with island conservation, within IUCN, with red list. So now our databases are perfectly linked. If you go to the red list, you see the invasive species that are threatening each threatened species, and you have a link to other databases, and the information have been included in these. So I still think that this is a very important area of work, and I'm keen to keep working on that. Thank you very much to all the friends who helped me with the slides, and to you all.
Okay, brilliant. So as you may have guessed, if you were very perceptive, we don't have time for any questions. So I'm going to move briefly on to Andrew Walsh. Andrew's here all the way from Lord Howe. It has been mentioned a couple of times in the previous day's presentations. I think we're all really looking forward to hearing how things are going out there. Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks, Claire. So I'm Andrew Walsh. I'm the project manager for the proposed Lord Howe Island Rodent Eradication Project. I've been living on Lord Howe now for 18 months. I guess I want to focus on the social aspects of the project rather than the technical aspects. And I guess I'm hoping that some of the mistakes that we've made and some of the lessons that we've learnt along the way are helpful for future eradications on inhabited islands. I want to briefly describe the island and the project, and then with regards to the social aspects, I want to talk about how we got here, where are we now, what are people still concerned about, and what are we doing about it. If you don't know where Lord Howe Island is, we're 600 kilometres east of the Australian mainland. We're a World Heritage Site. We've got some rugged mountains. Mount Gower at the back there is 850 metres. We've got a range of threatened and endemic species, including some critically endangered species that are at very high risk of extinction from rats. What makes us different from most rodent eradications to date is our permanent community and the associated livestock, pets and infrastructure that brings. So we've got a permanent community of 350 to 400 people in a settlement area of about 350 hectares. And we also have 16,000 tourists annually, and tourism is the mainstay of the island economy. We're trying to eradicate black rat and house mouse. We're using Britificum pellets from the combination of aerial, hand broadcast and bait stations. We've got a very large captive management program as part of the overall project, where we're taking in 220 wood hens, which are similar to a kiwi or a weka, and 140 currawongs, which are similar to a crow or a raven, into captivity. Concurrently, we'll be trying to eradicate an introduced masked owl by secondary poisoning, shooting and trapping. But our biggest challenge is the people in the settlement area, and that's really what I want to focus on today. So, how did we get here? Rats were introduced in 1918. We've had a long history of attempted control, hunting with dogs, we've had bounties, we've introduced owls, we've used a variety of poisons over the years. Eradication was first proposed in 2001. We had a technical feasibility study done, and it said that it was technically possible to do it. 2004, we did some more cost-benefit analysis, particularly around the palm industry. 2007 we did a bunch of trials on island and we tried to further define the project and the project risks. That led to the development of a draft eradication plan in 2009, and that plan was really the basis for the formal community engagement and for seeking funding. The project was funded in 2012. Has always been divisive in the community, and we've had our implementation delayed several times as we've had to work through community issues. What have we tried in the past? I think James mentioned yesterday that biologists are the biggest threats to island eradications. So we went in with scientists with a wealth of information and facts with very limited experience in community engagement. We tried pure science, logic and reasons. We held community hall meetings. We had workshops with subject matter experts. We tried one-on-one consultations. We had off-island consultants come in and help us. We've had numerous fact sheets and brochures. We've had a community working group. What went wrong? The pure science couldn't explain or satisfy the emotional issues that were coming up in the community when we were dealing with people's children, people's livelihoods, uncovering their fears. We learnt that the science is important, but the delivery is critical. We definitely had a plan that was too far down the track when we took it to the community, and there wasn't that opportunity for them to have significant buy-in or ownership of that plan. It led to the development of two schools of thoughts on the island. So the first one there was developed by the scientists presenting the program and some of the strong supporters of it. And we thought, why wouldn't people want this? This is going to be great. And then the community felt, or other elements of the community felt like we weren't included in your proposal. So the initial consultation was reactive and it didn't allow for community input. That was 2009 and we're still dealing with this legacy today. So where'd that get us? After the project was funded in 2012, we realised that there wasn't enough community support, which led to more focused community engagement. It led to a referendum of everyone on the island of voting age in 2015. James put this slide up yesterday as well. The referendum was proceed to planning and approval stage of an eradication or continue in an increased control scenario. We ended up with a 52% majority vote. The Lord Howe Island Board, which is the local council, made the decision to proceed to the planning and approvals phase based on that majority. We've got a final decision coming up in September of 2017. That decision will be based on, do we have the necessary approvals? Do we have enough money to do it? Is it technically feasible? And have we got enough community acceptance? I guess we spent the last 2 years really working on those aspects. So what are people still concerned about? What are their real and perceived issues? I'll go through these in a little bit more detail, but we're dealing with the lack of trust. We're dealing with the eradication method. We're dealing with environmental and non-target impacts. We're dealing with human health. We're dealing with tourism and the view that it won't work here. So how are we dealing with it? Our overall approach, I guess our community is fairly representative of a bell curve. We've got some people over on the right-hand side that are very strongly supportive of the program. We've got some people on the left that are very anti the program. We've got a whole bunch of people in the middle. I guess our focus has been shifting that bell curve to the right. We're doing that by building trust in the community. And building trust in this context is earning the right to have people listen to what we've got to say. We've got a resident community engagement officer now living on island, and I'm living on island as well. That allows us to have constant one-on-one engagement with the community, and it doesn't always have to be about rats. This is our most valuable communication tool, and we should have had resident staff from the very beginning. We're driving home key facts relevant to individuals. We're calling the bullshit. For too long, people in the community against the program have said whatever they wanted, whether it be true or not. We've started to stop that. We've recognised that we don't need 100% community support. What we need is 100% tolerance. We know that there's some people in that group that we're never actually going to change their minds. But that's okay. How can we get onto their properties? So I'll break down a little bit more detail about the things we're dealing with. So lack of trust. We're an island. We've got a community that's got a long history of mistrust of authority. How are we dealing with that? We're establishing trust through building rapport, building credibility. We're listening to people. We're doing what we say we'll do. We're being transparent. We're identifying individual community concerns, individual motivations, and addressing those. We're identifying how eradication will benefit individuals. A couple of examples there. We've initiated a hard waste clean-up on the island. We've removed over 400 tonnes of hard waste in the last 12 months. That's more than a tonne per person. So people are getting something for nothing. We've got some cattle owners who see the opportunity to remove their cattle as part of the eradication as an opportunity to upgrade the quality of their herd. A tomato eaten by a rat has much more value to some people than a seabird being eaten by a rat. Tomato that they grow in their garden. People have a problem still with the method, particularly the aerial distribution. So how are we dealing with that? We're taking people through the process of identifying the fatal flaws in the other options that we've ruled out. Again, this is something that should have been done from the start. We're dealing with people on an individual property level to explain to them how the baiting will occur on their property, how they would like it to happen on their property. The environmental and non-target impacts. We're walking people through what's happened on other eradications around the world, the impacts and the recovery. We're explaining the current impacts on Lord Howe Island with proof. There's a photo there of a black rat taking a black-winged petrel egg out of a nest on Lord Howe Island this year. That's more valuable to us than 1,000 reports. We're talking to people about what happens if we don't proceed with the eradication. What happens if we continue to use the current control poisoning scenario? What happens to those continued impacts to biodiversity? Human health. We're now on to our third human health risk assessment. What was wrong with the first two? Nothing. It's just the community didn't see them as independent. So we've gone through a process now of identifying who the community would be comfortable with to undertake that assessment. We've had the community involved in engaging those specialists. We've given the community the opportunity to raise those concerns without us present. Now we've got a job to do, I guess, to explain the outcomes of this latest report. People are worried about the impacts to tourism. So we've broken down, why do tourists visit Lord Howe Island? What is the value of the World Heritage listing? What is the value of threatened species? We've recently had an economic evaluation done, and we believe it's the first economic evaluation of a rodent eradication in the published literature. And now we're describing the tangible benefits to the community. We hear that it won't work here. Despite all of the islands where it's worked, people only want to compare it to Henderson. So we're talking to the community about the differences and the similarities in those other eradications. We're learning from successes and failures. We're explaining our biosecurity and detection network to prevent reinvasion. I guess the last slide is really about our approach to getting it done. We're building trust in the community by being part of the community, and only by being part of that community can we understand those individual concerns and motivations and address them. Just a couple of examples there. You can do community engagement on rodent eradications through fishing, through barbecues, through walking your dog on the beach, through buying a beer, sharing it with someone, thanking them for a good job, from sending a local guy over to an international rugby tournament, from empowering locals to be part of our team, to getting locals onto properties to clean up hard waste. I guess what we've learnt is we need to be passionate, we need to be resilient, we need to be interested in the people, and we need to go the extra mile to succeed. Hopefully we'll get the decision to proceed in September, and by this time next year will be implemented. The last slide there is actually a quote from our opposition's Facebook. We want to say that we completely agree, and just sometimes there's different methods to secure the outcome. Thank you.
Thank you very very much, Andrew. And I'm sure people will want to ask you questions, but I would encourage them to do that in the breaks. You know what he looks like. You can find him again. Now I'd like to welcome Phil Andreozzi from the USDA's Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service. And Phil's going to talk to us about the Pacific Invasives Partnership.
Thanks very much. Can you all hear me? Okay, great. Thank you. It's fantastic to be here again. I was at the one 7 years ago, and it's so inspiring to be here and hear all these presentations about the great work that's going on and the progress and successes and new things we know how to do and some of the same old problems that we still have as well. This is a picture of the Pacific Invasives Partnership. Our meeting last month in Hawaii. Our Hawaii partners put on an amazing show of hospitality and presentations for us. We've heard a lot of presentations today and yesterday discussing specific projects with fantastic, beautiful color photos of amazing places and horrific scenes. This is not one of them. But this is something it does have in common with all these other presentations, is that all these other presentations generally have a page showing all the partners, because as we all know, invasive species requires a partnership. It requires multiple people with expertise and input. And that's what this presentation is really about, just on a different frame. So, Pacific Invasives Partnership, PIP. A little background, was created to be the Invasive Species Working Group of the Pacific Roundtable on Conservation of Nature, which is another partnership, essentially a coalition of various groups, governmental, regional governmental, NGOs, et cetera, working to created to increase effective conservation in the Pacific Island region. As PIP has gone on, this is about 10, 15 years ago it was created, it's really evolved into a broader mandate, acknowledging invasive species don't just affect biodiversity and nature conservation, but a variety of other issues. PIP has evolved into a broader advocate of invasive alien species issues and outreach, and this is perhaps my favorite descriptor of PIP, is developed into a kind of incubator for collaborative efforts and for good ideas on the ways in which we can make progress in the Pacific, and another important networking opportunity for Pacific partners. Membership in PIP is entirely voluntary. And as an informal group, by joining PIP, you're not committing to do anything. There are no commitments, no fees, no requirements, no obligations other than you are saying that you are willing to work with other Pacific partners to address large-scale invasive species issues that affect the entire Pacific. Members, as I mentioned, are NGOs such as BirdLife International, Island Conservation, IUCN, TNC, Conservation International has been a member. National government representatives such as Landcare Research in New Zealand, myself, USDA APHIS, the Palau National Invasive Species Council, the Hawaii Invasive Species Council, and a few others. And then regional and international organizations such as the Pacific Invasives Initiative, the Micronesia Regional Invasive Species Council, SPREP, SPC, UNAP Environment Program, and a few others. The mantra of PIP is that all the different PIP members come with their own expertise, with their own concerns. I work for USDA APHIS, that is very agricultural in focus, but not entirely. Lots of other members work on birds, specifically to bird issues, or specifically to ag or commodities, or to natural resource or biodiversity issues. But we all understand that the more we work together to address the issue of invasive species as a holistic issue that affects every major component of life and important issues in the Pacific, the more that we all benefit. The rising tide floats all boats. Again, it's a fundamental underpinning issue of Pacific Island countries and territory, economies, environments, and future sustainability. PIP is an informal venue to discuss crazy ideas that you think might work, but you want the right audience to bounce them off of. It allows, again, outside-the-box ideas to be developed. Our diverse membership is not only good for the relative expertise that it brings in, but there's really not another venue where NGOs, regional organizations, national governments, and other partners can all have a longer, in-depth conversation and update each other on what we're doing. And of course, in these updates, it ticks ideas in people's minds on how different entities can be collaborating together. And then we all get together and eat mangoes, and friendships and trust lead to successful collaborations. That was an inside joke, sorry. How is PIP different than other groups? Again, PIP is big picture. The only requirement is that we think of things that affect multiple Pacific Island nations and jurisdictions at the same time. We look at all invasive species. We are both marine, freshwater, terrestrial, pathogens to vertebrates and everything in between, though admittedly our representation right now is a little weak on the marine sector, but we're working on that. An example of what is not, the Pacific Invasive Learning Network, PILN, which is another excellent organization group, is much more technical, field-based, how we work together on methodology and things that are useful directly in the field. That is a wonderful organization, but PIP operates at a higher strategic level. Both build relationships and enhance collaborative efforts. As I mentioned, yes, PIP, so we work on collaborative efforts that benefit the entire Pacific or at least multiple jurisdictions at the same time, and we also provide a venue for the PIP members who would otherwise perhaps not get as much of an opportunity to talk about, collaborate, learn what each other are doing, to develop smaller collaborations. And again, this is an important point, we are voluntary and informal. Some things that we've been working on over the last 5 years. We've been fortunate enough to be able to help prepare reports and briefing materials for some high-level meetings that have gone on, such as the Pacific Islands Forum Leaders Meeting, the UN Small Island Developing States Conference, which happened in Samoa a few years ago, the Micronesian Islands Forum, etc. At these meetings and at these conferences, several significant high-level statements linking the importance of invasive species to a variety of issues, including resilience and food security, et cetera, has been come out. We'd like to think we had a role in helping that happen. We also work with different partners who are putting together GEF proposals, and we've worked a lot on the invasive species management guidelines, which came out a few years as well. We work a lot with regional and sub-regional initiatives. I'll touch on some of those in a moment, and biosecurity, insect, rodent, other high-level burning issues in the Pacific. And we always raise the invasive species and the PIP flag at various international fora, such as the CBD, World Conservation Congress, et cetera, Ramsar. Current PIP goals can be broken up into 4 areas: high-level engagement, regional efforts, raise a profile of invasive species, and thematic issues. And it's important to mention that PIP meets at least once in person per year, so that was a meeting in June last week, and we have multiple phone calls across the Pacific every year, and that's how we get most of our work done. For the Pacific high-level engagement, we will be actively working on how we can engage with and enhance the Honolulu Challenge. We're following up on a mandate or a suggestion from a recent Pacific Island Leaders Forum, where it suggested that we investigate the creation of a Pacific Invasive Species Advisory Group to the forum. As examples of regional efforts, we'll be actively supporting the region of Micronesia as they update and implement the regional biosecurity plan for Micronesia and Hawaii. We're also helping our partners with Jeff 6 and Green Climate Fund proposals, ideas and development. We raise the flag, engage and wave the flag at multiple venues such as this when PIP members are there, as this meeting. And we're working on a few thematic issues that are of particular importance or significance in the Pacific. One is the Pacific Invasive Ant Prevention Program, one is the Pacific Biocontrol Strategy, and the other is the coconut rhinoceros beetle, which I'll go into and show you a scary video in just a moment. But I guess the overall mandate or the mantra of PIP, and one of the main messages we try to promote is, if you prevent, control, eradicate invasive species on islands, or anywhere for that matter, you directly benefit the resilience of that island, the biodiversity, the ecosystem and habitats, obviously, but also the food security, the economic output, the agricultural output and the economic output, human health, livelihoods, quality of life. All of these things are some major components to what goes into island sustainability. So the message is, it's not just biodiversity, it's everything, and the more we all work together on the issue of invasive species, both eradications and prevention, the more we all benefit. So, with that, I will show, if I could, it'll help. I chose this one to go into a bit more detail on because nobody else I saw is talking about this issue right now. It's kind of burgeoning issue, but it's one of the, if debatably, the major issue in the Pacific right now. This is a video taken on Guam by a colleague at the University of Guam, Dr. Aubrey Moore. And it's great on this big screen because you can see back to the tree line. It's going to get worse in a moment, so I'll talk. Coconut rhinoceros beetle, as many of you may know, came to the Pacific in the 50s, 60s, 70s, quickly started eradicating the vast majority of palm trees on many islands where it was infested. There was a large international research undertaking, and several successful biocontrols were introduced, and an equilibrium was reached. In 2007, it got to the island of Guam for the first time. A very relatively high quality and well-funded and quick response was attempted, which was unsuccessful because the brown tree snake is one of the reasons, but I don't have time to talk about that right now. And so they went to biocontrol, and they found out that the biocontrol wasn't working. They found out the biocontrols weren't working because this is a new biotype of coconut rhinoceros beetle that is immune to the existing biocontrols. So all of Guam does not look like this. This is probably the worst part of Guam that we've seen so far, but did you see the name of the resort that they showed? Royal Palms. But right now we have no way to stop this. Since it got to Guam, it has also arrived in Palau. It is now in Hawaii, where there is a very significant effort to try to eradicate it on the island of Oahu going on. It's also in Papua New Guinea. It's in the Solomon Islands. When it runs out of coconut palms, it will go to other palms, such as betel nut palms, such as oil palms. And now it's going to the next one. Thank you. Sorry, it was a YouTube video that we just did. So one of the things that PIP is helping with is to develop, to pull together the right international partners to develop biocontrol, find a biocontrol that's actually effective, and start figuring out how we can stop this from spreading around the Pacific. It's not just a threat for the Pacific, it is island hopping across the Pacific right now. As I mentioned, it's in Honolulu. There's a real fear it could get to the US and to California and all the places where we have coconut palms. But perhaps most importantly, from an international perspective, coconut rhinoceros beetle does not occur in the New World. What if this hit the New World and we don't have a biocontrol and it's doing that to the entire New World? Would it do that? Let's never find out. Okay. Oh, I'm red. Okay. PIP works. Sorry. So I think PIP works. We're just a good venue that doesn't exist. We're informal. You only join PIP if you want to talk about the big pictures and have a group of similarly concerned experts in your area to talk about these ideas and build additional collaborations and advanced mandates. It's testing ground for big ideas, spawns other collaborations. I think that if you have the right set of partners who are willing to do this, this idea could work elsewhere. There's one more picture that was from our the other venue in Hawaii. Again, thank you, Hawaii. Happy to not answer questions right now, but afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. Okay, I'd now like to welcome Genovesi Meyer. Genovesi is the head of the research department of the French Polynesian government. He's going to be telling us about islander perceptions of invasive species. Thanks, Genovesi.
Thanks a lot. Hi, everybody. Bonjour à tous. Kia ora nā tātou. Aloha kakao to my Hawaiian colleagues and friends. Kia ora to the Kiwis. Bula to the Fijians. Talofa to the Samoans. So today my talk will be focused on islander perception of invasive species in small remote islands of French Polynesia. So we stay in the Pacific, and I will try to focus on the role of socio-economy and culture. And this talk was prepared with one of my former grad students, Marie Fordiniez, and she's now the coordinator of an invasive species group based and funded by the Department of Environment at the French Polynesian government. And myself, I'm working for the French Polynesian government for the past 20 years. Well, none of us, the two of us, we are not social scientists. But as James Russell said yesterday in his keynote talk, after decades of trying to manage an invasive species, you become a social scientist. And you may enjoy it or you don't have a choice. Okay, it was said that invasive species are recognized as a major driver of biodiversity loss and an agent of global change. But as you may know, human attitudes and perception may vary at a regional level or even at a local level, because you deal with different stakeholders, with different views, and sometimes opposite views. Two examples from Polynesia, from the South Pacific. The first one is feral pigs, or wild boar. They were introduced first by Polynesians between 1,500 years ago, and then by Europeans 200 years ago. And now feral pigs are considered as a major threat to native biodiversity, both endemic plants and endemic invertebrates. The second example is Myconia calvescens. It's a small tree native to tropical Central America, which was introduced as an ornamental in Tahiti in the 30s and in Hawaii in the 60s. And it's forming those dense monospecific stands in lowland rainforest up to mountain cloud forest. However, local people may have different perception, and pigs in the South Pacific, in Polynesia in particular, are domesticated, so they are domestic animals, and pigs have a very strong cultural value in the South Pacific. 3 years ago, we had this annual dance festival in Tahiti, and this Tahitian dance group won the first prize, or the prize of unfortunately, the best costume, and it was a costume made of Myconia leaves. So I was relatively sad and devastated. That's maybe why I conducted that study. Okay, the other importance of trying to understand the human dimensions of invasive species management is to try to mitigate or avoid conflicts of interest. And I will give you two famous examples. One is strawberry guava, a small tree native to South America, which is now highly invasive in most of the Pacific Islands, and also in the Mascarene Islands, in Mauritius, and in La Réunion. And in La Réunion Island, another French territory, strawberry guava has its own festival because it has edible, fleshy fruits which are used to do very nice, tasty jams and fruit juice and sorbet. And there's also a queen of beauty for strawberry guava. Another example is gorse, which is native from Europe, including Great Britain, and now highly invasive in Australia, New Zealand, and La Réunion Island. And in New Zealand, the farmers considered it as a very valuable species because of its attractive flowers for honeybees. It's also considered as a shelter plant for shelter species for other plants because it promotes recruitment of native and tree species, and also a shelter for endemic birds. So for a long time, it took maybe a decade for the local authorities of New Zealand to release natural enemies during a biological control programs because of this opposition of some other stakeholders. And the same story did happen to the strawberry guava in Hawaii. So the human dimension has to be addressed, and since this landmark book published by IUCN in 2000, there were many reviews and many interests and many publications, especially during the past decades. And most of those studies were conducted in well-developed Western countries, such as Europe, including Scotland, North America, Canada, Australia, and some other places. But very few social studies were conducted in less developed countries, including in the South Pacific Islands. So that's the objective of my study today. And I had two challenges. One challenge is to try to prioritize invasive alien species for early eradication or long-term control with the support and engagement of local communities, because I'm working in small remote islands with very low capacities. We also tested some hypotheses, classical hypotheses. Is the number of invasive species decreasing with remoteness or increasing maybe with urbanization or population number? Are there different perception and attitude towards the invasive species related to these socio-economic developments? And what's the role and importance of cultural or traditional values in those islands? So the method we conducted with Mary, I should say she conducted, she went on the field, a large awareness campaign, an 8-month campaign, and dealing with 46 invasive species which were legally declared a threat to biodiversity in French Polynesia, including 35 species, plants, and 11 animals. And it's only a subset of the total number of invasive species in French Polynesia, but they were the top priority. We published books, flyers, posters, and as you can see on the picture, most of those species are well known in other tropical islands, and they belong to this list of the world's worst invasive species worldwide. So we surveyed 19 small islands in 4 different archipelagos, but we excluded the islands of Tahiti and Moorea, the largest island, the more populated and urbanized island of Tahiti, Moorea. So Tahiti here in Society Islands, so we worked in the leeward islands of the Society, the Austral Islands, the Tuamotu, and the distant Marquesas. Public meetings were organized in city halls and community houses in 41 different villages. We had more than 2,000 participants, including 1,700 adults, and the rest were school children. And in French Polynesia and in the South Pacific in general, it's oral tradition, so you don't give a questionnaire to people to have them fill up. It's much more open question and discussion, and the discussion is sometimes in French, sometimes it's in one of the Polynesian language, Tahitian, Marquesan, Paumotu, etc. We systematically record the positive comments. Positive comments means people think the species have benefits, the neutral and negative comments on all the invasive species which are present in each of those islands. The results, so we didn't find any relation between the number of invasive species and the distance from Tahiti. Tahiti is a kind of transportation hub with an international airport and port. So as you can see, there's plenty of, a high number of invasive species in the Marquesas. Tuamotu has less invasive species because Tuamotu are atolls made of atolls, low-lying islands with very rough ecological conditions. The most populated islands are the most invaded, so it was not so surprising. And also the islands with the more invasive species were the islands which were connected with Tahiti with many flights from Tahiti. And this connection, this socio-economic connection, can be considered as a proxy of socio-economic development. Back to the comments. So as you can see on this graph, there were much more comments, total comments, in the remote archipelagos. And in the Tuamotu, it was a bit surprising. But, well, they have less invasive species, but we receive only positive comments on those species. This is probably because in those remote islands, people have still living in a traditional way of life, and they are much more dependent on their natural resources, marine and terrestrial. And another interesting result, if you remember the talk of Colin this morning, Lantana camera, which is an old introduction, has received more positive comments. So some of the old introduced species have much more positive comments, are considered as useful, etc. Looking at the different perception of invasive species by taxa, and I show you only the taxa where we get some positive comments. And it was also very interesting because the common myna, which is actively controlled in Tahiti because it's a threat to endemic bird, received only positive comments from the people, especially in the leeward islands, because myna are considered as a good predator to control wasps and ticks, which are considered as pests. Some species have both positive and negative comments. Flemingia strobilifera is forming very dense cover under coconut plantation, so it's considered as a noxious species for some people, but on the other way, the flowers and the fruits are used in necklaces. And of course, the fruit-bearing trees, such as Suriname cherry, rose apple, have received both positive and negative comments because the fruits are edible. Conclusion, well, islander perception may vary between archipelagos. and sometimes among islands in the same archipelagos, and this depends on socioeconomic development. And okay. In the South Pacific in general, in French Polynesia in particular, there's still some strong and long-lasting cultural values. A lot of species have utilitarian values or aesthetic values, whatever their status, biogeographical status. But what we observe is that there's, some people call it indigenization. I prefer the term of heritageization, sorry, it's patrimonisation in French, of those old introduced and natural species, those species introduced by Polynesian a long time ago and by European 200 years ago. And now it's part of a natural and cultural heritage. So the conclusion is that you have to take care to address those social and cultural acceptability in invasive species management. So I don't have time to discuss about islandness. And I'd like to thank you and to thank Mary, who did most of the job. And I dedicate this talk to one of my Hawaiian mentors, Lloyd Loop, who passed away last week. And he was famous in our community of conservation biologists in the Pacific. Mahalo, maruru, thanks a lot.
Genovesi. So we now have not just one Tyler as in the program, but two Tylers. They will introduce themselves, but they are going to talk to us about HAIDA GWAII.
Click. Click. Next one, previous one, laser point. Perfect. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tyler Bellis. I am a member of the HAIDA Nation. My HAIDA name is Kunhialis. I come from the Yakwanis Raven Clan of Northern HAIDA GWAII. Currently, I'm an elected politician for the Council of the HAIDA Nation. Previous to that, I worked in the industry, forest industry, and for the Council of the HAIDA Nation as a staff member.
And hi, everybody. My name is Tyler Peet. I work for Parks Canada Agency with the GWAII National Park Reserve, National Marine Conservation Area Reserve, and HAIDA Heritage Site. And we're going to talk to you about a number of things today. I don't think either Tyler or myself would identify ourselves as subject matter experts in the topic of invasive species eradications on islands. However, a number of them have happened on HAIDA GWAII. So rather than get into the technical details of any one of those projects, we're going to come at it from a different direction. We're going to first introduce you to HAIDA GWAII and to GWAII. We'll talk a bit about the significance of invasives management to the HAIDA Nation. We will list some projects that have occurred on the archipelago, and we'll spend some time sharing our thoughts about the future management directions for GWAII and also what the Council of the HAIDA Nation has in mind. So first of all, HAIDA GWAII, it's in the HAIDA language. It translates directly as Islands of the People. And sorry, I'm a little loud here. It's a group of over 150 islands totaling about 10,000 square kilometers. The archipelago is located about 100 kilometers west of mainland British Columbia. Thousands of years ago, when sea levels were much lower, about 150 meters lower than they are currently, the HAIDA GWAII was connected to the land connected to the mainland. But today, so as a consequence, we share several species, but many of the species present on HAIDA GWAII are unique genetic subvariants of the ones found on the mainland. So the archipelago has global importance due to the number of breeding colonies for seabirds and its conservation. And in conservation terms, it's the first place in Canada to carry out restoration work with respect to invasive species eradications. There's archaeological evidence that the HAIDA have called HAIDA GWAII home for, since before the last ice age, at least 13,000 years ago, and some estimates put it much, much longer than that. It's estimated that about 30,000 HAIDA people lived in many villages and seasonal camps all over the islands. And after contact, after European contact, disease reduced the HAIDA people drastically to a population as low as 550 people, and the remaining people gathered in 2 villages. I'm just going to adjust my mic, pardon me. How's that? Is that better? There's now approximately 2,500 HAIDA people living in 2 communities on HAIDA GWAII and about the same living off-island. Since so much was lost, the Haida are working very hard to preserve their language, the culture, art, and traditional ways, and particularly preserving the land that makes them who they are. No treaty's ever been signed by the Haida Nation, and in 2002, the Haida filed their title case with the Supreme Court of Canada, which is to say they challenged the notion that the Government of Canada owned the archipelago. So GWAII, which in the Haida language translates to Islands of Beauty, is the southern third of Haida GWAII, and it's currently managed and protected by two groups, the Council of the Haida Nation and the Government of Canada. It's a national park reserve, a Haida heritage site, and a national marine conservation area reserve. It's a bit of a mouthful, so we just go by GWAII commonly. And it was protected due to blockades and protests in 1985 by Haida Nation members. GWAII is protected on paper, but in reality, many losses have been incurred since the area was originally protected due to introduced species such as deer and rats. So one of the things that makes GWAII somewhat unusual and unique is the GWAII agreement that started it all. In 1993, it recognized that the Haida Nation and the Government of Canada could agree on the preservation and conservation goals and set aside the whole discussion around land ownership, which allowed them to sort of focus on protection and management. GWAII management decisions are made by the Archipelago Management Board, which is comprised of 3 members from the Council of the Haida Nation and 3 members from the Government of Canada. One of the many lenses that the AMB brings to consider management decisions is the impact that those decisions may have on Haida culture and on the Haida people. Now, this is important not only because of the rich cultural history of the nation that stretches back thousands of years, but also because even today it remains so powerful and so alive. So introduced species have been identified as the main threat to ecological integrity within GWAII. For instance, deer. Introduced in the 1800s, the species has become hyperabundant and is literally changing the landscape, the forest, the composition of the landscape level. Conservation gains from introduced species removals are wide-ranging and large, with species returning and complex interactions, rebuilding at all levels of the systems, and this is fairly well understood. But what we're going to be talking to you about today is the potential implications from a Haida perspective on what these projects may provide for the Haida Nation.
Thanks, Tyler. So I'm going to be reading a little bit off of the page here, and when we practiced this, it was a bit more freelance, and Haidas are known for being fearless warriors and super aggressive, but these beautiful ladies have me scared today about timelines, and so we rehearsed and rehearsed again and just put it on paper. So, so ecosystems impoverished by invasive species have a direct impact on Haida people. The Haida consider it their responsibility to care for the islands, as the islands have, sorry, I'm blind too. As the islands have cared for them for millennia. As the natural systems of the island suffer, so do the people. Impacts of invasive species mean a loss of culturally significant plants and animals on Haida GWAII, lack of opportunity to accessible medicinal and edible plants, a loss of traditional food sources, for example, fruiting plants, seabirds, and their eggs. Cultural impacts of invasive species on Haida GWAII. Fewer holistic ecosystems in general remove Haida people's ability to practice their traditional rights and cultural activities. This hampers the Haida people's continued desire to return to traditional practices, be they on land or water. And here we have an example of a Haida harvesting herring eggs that they lay on kelp. And we also collect cedar bark, which we make into clothing, baskets, other regalia, and the deer have a devastating effect on our cedar. They eat the young cedar, tons. So like Tyler mentioned, there was, at one point in time, there was approximately only 550 HAIDAs left, and that could have been from numbers up to 30,000. And this was after the smallpox epidemic. Throughout all of this, the HAIDAs have been the caretakers of Haida Gwaii, and the responsibility of ownership has always rested with us. Our culture survived decades of prosecution, and this resilience eventually led to the formation of the Council of the Haida Nation. So that's our government that oversees the islands and the Haida people. The main purpose of the CHN is to achieve legal title to Haida Gwaii and the surrounding waters, but many other gains have been achieved by this Haida government. For example, the co-management of Gwaii, development of a 1,000-year cedar strategy, establishing the Haida Gwaii land use orders and the forest management regime based on ecosystem-based management. This provides for the protection of culturally significant areas from logging practices and ensures Haida values are maintained in where logging occurs. The CHN has also established new protected areas and has designed effectiveness monitoring, collecting data for the management decisions and research. So that map illustrates, you see Gwaii on the bottom, but now all the other areas in blue are also protected. It's about half of the island, and the rest is being managed through EBM. And a lot of those measures are because of deer. They're them eating our culturally significant plants, cedar, etc. So here's a few examples of invasive mammal projects that have occurred on Haida Gwaii to date.
I'll just flag a couple for everybody. Langara Island Rat Eradication Project back in 1995. It's come up in a couple of presentations. It's significant for a number of reasons, but not the least that it was the first initiative to take place on the island, and it was a partnership between the Council of the Haida Nation and the Canadian Wildlife Service. And I'll just, in 2009, we had Nightbirds Returning, which was another rat eradication that focused on restoring seabird habitat. And finally, currently, ongoing and due to wrap, hopefully in about 2 weeks' time, Restoring Balance, which is a deer eradication project.
So when it comes to invasive species management, the focus of the Council of the Haida Nation to date has been to collaborate with the provincial and federal authorities on achieving shared objectives. The nation now directs targeted funding to invasive species management, but it's still the early days. The Council of the Haida Nation is working to determine what the priorities of the nation are and to quantify the challenges that stand in the way. Whatever the focus becomes, it's likely to target species that impact cultural practices. We will start looking at invasive species management to create healthy ecosystems for future generations. There are basic principles that the Haida Nation applies to planning all initiatives, including invasive species management. These principles are.
So just a couple pictures of it before we go on. There's the first shot was a group from the Langara Rat Eradication Project. I'll just note that Tyler's father participated in that, as well as Greg Howell and a bunch of other folks. I don't think any of them are in that picture. The second one is a screenshot of the inventory work that the CHN have been doing in conjunction with the province of BC to catalog terrestrial invasive plant species. And then this is a shot from our ongoing project of Restoring Balance. So Tyler was about to tell you about the principles that are invoked in the CHN plannings.
The first being that of, oh, I got it messed up. Interconnectedness. Everything depends on everything else. The principle of interconnectedness is fundamental to integrated planning and management. This comprehensive approach considers the relationships between species and habitats, effects on human activities, on the environment. Interrelationships are accounted for across spatial and temporal scales across agencies and jurisdictions. Balance, quickly, and respect.
Just a quick shout out to the project contributors. Without them helping us out on Haida Gwaii, we wouldn't be getting nearly the quality of work done that we are. So thank you to all.
So we have actually finished on time, so if anyone does have any questions for any of our speakers, for the Tylers or any of the speakers, we've probably got time for one or two before everyone has to dash off. Yeah, James, can someone, is there anyone with a microphone?
Just for the last speakers there, I thought it was interesting that people living on an island and in balance with it and reflecting on what the previous speaker said about heritageization, I was curious to see that there was support for deer eradication. I was wondering what the Haida people's relationship with the deer was previously and how that led to the pathway of them being eradicated from at least the parts of the island where they're coming from.
Well, the issue of deer is a complicated one for the people of Haida GWAII and Haida in general because, number one, it does affect a lot of our cultural and medicinal plants, but it's also a main food source today. And throughout the year, like Haida people have been impoverished and faced lots of struggles. So, and when that happens and it's a main food source, there's a lot of disagreement on what should be done with the deer. So I'm of the opinion, like I wish I could snap my fingers and they'd all be gone and the plant community would return. But that's not the same for all Haida people. So this question hasn't been answered yet what the end goal is. But with projects like what's happening in GWAII, we're hoping to use it as an example, show them how vegetation can come back, because it's amazing. There was a slide there with deer enclosures, and as soon as the deer are gone, it's back up. And these plants that are super rare, like Devil's Club, reappear on the landscape, and they're very important to us as well. So I don't have all the answers. The Haida people don't right now, and we're just kind of addressing it, because a lot of our focus before has just been protection of what's still there, and now it's looking forward to the future and where we're going.
I'm afraid we don't have any time for any more questions, but I think the speakers have all been really fascinating. I think we could have grilled them for another hour probably and still not gotten to the end. So thanks to everyone who's come along. Just before you all dash off, I wanted to let you know that the Tropical Island discussion or workshop that was cancelled has now been reinstated by Richard Griffiths from Island Conservation, so that will be happening tomorrow. If you're interested in attending that, find Richard. We'll probably be meeting in the foyer tomorrow morning at 9 for people who want to come along. Also, I've realised I didn't introduce myself at the start, so I'm Claire Stringer. I work for the Royal Society for Protection of Birds in the UK's BirdLife partner, and I've had the privilege of being involved with quite a few eradications over the years, including the not-so-successful Henderson operation and the hopefully soon-to-be successful Gough project. Thanks very much for attending. I'd like you all to join me in thanking our speakers again. I think they've been a brilliant lineup. Thanks so much.